Good morning, folks. You know, that never happens at home. When I say anything, it just never, nobody gets quiet. Thank you all very much for being here. Good morning. I am Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Hoover Commission. Today's hearing provides the Commission with an introduction to the state's forest management practices in response to the tree mortality crisis that has killed 102 million trees in California. This is our first hearing on the topic. Our intention today is to focus on the state. We will want to hear from others on this topic, including local officials, Native American tribes, environmental groups, and others who are closer to where the problem lies. The Commission will make sure that these voices are included in our study process. And just a sort of a personal insight. When I was in the Assembly, I found that a career in politics is different from a lot of other endeavors. In that, let me explain, in that nobody would think they could substitute themselves for a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist or any of those kinds of specialized activities, but everybody thinks they can do your job better. And I've got a feeling that when you're in forest management, you probably have that same experience. Everybody, I am sure, has told you what needs to be done with these trees. Why don't you chop it up and put it on playgrounds? Why don't you do this with it? Why don't you do that with it? So I'm feeling this kind of connection with all of you.
Good morning. Our first witness is Scott Stevens. He is a professor of fire science in the Department of Environmental Science Policy and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. He also is the director of the University of California Center for Fire Science and Outreach, co-director of the University of California Center for Forestry, and leader of the California Fire Science Consortium. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come today. Now, we look today at the forests of California, we see the southern Sierra Nevada, we see the mortality, and it really gets to our soul sometimes. And when we look at that, to me, I see that really as a symptom of a much larger problem. The forests in California are really not in a sustainable condition. And that really comes from a couple of reasons primarily. One is past harvesting, the largest trees removed in most of our forests. Another thing is this idea of fire suppression that you're all aware of that's been going on for 100 years. So you take fire out of a system that used to burn every 5, 10, 15 years, and of course you're going to change it, and then you're going to change it by increasing forest density and really changing its character. That's where we are today. Climate change is no doubt having an impact, but it's actually a much smaller impact. In some ways that's good news, because it shows us we can do things today to actually make a difference, and climate change is not going to really run the train. So if you did manage lightning fire, you're probably looking at maybe a decade or two to really get some of that character in there. If you want to do restoration mechanically and prescribed burning, you could do it even faster because you can actually target areas. Another thing you could do too is you could take some of those mechanical treatments, prescribed fires in a region of a watershed, do it to actually make it easier to manage lightning fire further, right? So you're going to cut off a fire, essentially, maybe take it away a little bit potentially from a community, or take it away from maybe a river, take it away from a freeway. So you would maybe use those strategically.
So I do have one other question. You've now spoken quite a bit about prescribed fires. What are the tools you need in your toolbox to do that?
That's a great question. So there's really a few things. One thing is experience. And this is a big deal because we've got some great people in this state. Brent Skaggs and others have been working on this for decades. The other thing we're going to do is essentially start to plan our burns and maybe do them in off times. I've written about maybe doing things in winter. You know, this 4-year drought we just came through, you could have burned like mad in the winter in some places. Burn at night. This is a challenge too because at night's always a little bit more dangerous because it's just the conditions. But I've been burning the Sierra Nevada for 15, 20 years, and almost all of our fires are at night. Go through that night cycle when it gets colder, humidity comes up. You basically make your stand, you burn. Daytime, you just hold the fire and you just watch. Even a workforce that's dedicated to that. That's another thing that could be powerful, right? Of course, we have big fires in this country every year, but if we always keep taking our people off that are trying to do progressive burning or other activities and just send them to Alaska to chase a fire, then we're always getting behind the hole. I get a little nervous sometimes myself when we think, I hear more and more discussion about more aircraft, 747s, we just need bigger and better, right? And right now we're putting out 98% of all fires less than an acre in size, 98% already. So when you think about getting the next 2%, I think in some ways it's probably infeasible. So I'm really interested in the technology and the ideas of kind of this coming forward, but it can't be a surrogate for a change in forest structure for resiliency for the future. That's the base. If we don't do that, we're going to keep chasing our tail for the end of the world.
As some communities think about desal, and you know, and desal water takes a tremendous amount of energy.
Yes.
Has significant environmental consequences, and it's going to cost the public about $3,000 an acre foot.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that if you're doing what you're talking about in the forest, you can have better forest yield, healthier habitat, and water recovery at a cost that is less than $3,000 an acre foot sold.
Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of makes economic sense that way. There's a lot of benefits to it as compared to just thinking that you're going to plug in a desal plant and everybody's going to be happy with it.
No, I agree.
How can you make accessible the choices between bad options? So I'm not an expert, you're the expert. So there's fire suppression, there's a whole list of things that you gave. Saying all of the above are necessary and that we have to do it at an order of magnitude of 10 times more than what we've been doing is daunting.
Yes.
What are the trade-offs? In other words, let's take your plan A, the 10-time plan. What if we didn't do that? What are the adverse consequences, and what are the really adverse consequences if we keep doing what we've been doing, which is digging ourselves further into a hole?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I do think if we continued path of suppression, we have to have suppression. We got 40 million people in this state, people living all over it, and we really are at risk, right? So we need that suppression angle. We have to have it. But then that can't be our focus for the long term, because the rim fire, the moonlight fire, the king fire, they keep coming, right? They come in Southern California as well.
Dr. Stevens really teed up the discussion very, very well. It laid the foundation for not only what's occurring with the tree mortality, but with California's forests in general. What's important to point out is that there are about 32 million acres of forest land in California. Talked about prescribed fire. That's key. We absolutely need to re-engage and significantly increase our pace and scale of prescribed fire. So again, there's an effort afoot. There's a prescribed fire MOU signed by many, many organizations to re-engage in the discussion and leverage the opportunity for more expertise and more support and increasing the pace and scale of prescribed fire on the ground. But in order to introduce that, it's going to take all of the tools in the toolbox. This is a perfect opportunity where we're all agreeing in the same area to engage in forest management. We have a perfect opportunity right now to leverage engaging in our forest going forward. So thank you.
Commissioner
If you had 1 minute, this is more than 140 characters, but it's only 1 minute, and you could tell the governor, I want you to do 3 things. Keep it in a minute. What are the 3 things from your agency perspective, not speaking for everybody?
So,
And more money doesn't count.
so what I have learned, and say this is keenly interested in this discussion, and I can tell you the things we have spoken to him about right along the lines of that question is, 1, increased pace and scale of prescribed fire, that we want to continue to work through the social acceptance of putting fire on the ground, that absolutely we want to continue in increasing the pace and scale and getting more social license to put more fire on the ground. It's 2, continuing to invest in public resources and public-private partnerships and collaboratives to do these projects. And certainly that means investing cap-and-trade funding, SRA fire prevention funds, and the myriad of availability of things. But we must have a continued investment and increased investment in forest health and forest management policy.
In OES's role, one of the reasons we are co-chairing is that, when the governor does proclaim a state of emergency, OES, as his Office of Emergency Services, is tasked with that function of bringing together all the players and leveraging all of the state statutes under the Emergency Services Act The Emergency Services Act, of course, is a very powerful act that allows us to streamline the process of bureaucracy or any hurdles that may be in place to be able to effectively mitigate an evolving disaster. And so in this case, really it was to make sure that the Emergency Services Act was brought to bear effectively in supporting CAL FIRE and the other entities. And it was also giving authorities to organizations like Caltrans and the California Conservation Corps and the National Guard and other entities to be able to provide resources without question that this was truly an emergency and that we're moving forward. Beyond that, really, there's a program under the Emergency Services Act called the California Disaster Assistance Act. And really that is the act that actually provides funding to local government as a result of a disaster to provide grants. And there are prevention grants, there are other kinds of grants, and then monies that the legislature, the governor provided to be able to immediately deal with the effects of this particular disaster. As of June, close to $190 million in state funding has been spent in response to this particular event. And initial damage assessments provided by counties, $132 million in estimates. And at this point, really, CDA and that program has really obligated about $500,000. And part of that is because it's not a 100% money. It's based upon local governments. If there's truly an emergency, local governments proclaim a local emergency. They need to act. They act. They respond with their resources, and then based upon that response and the actions that they take, CDA can come in and reimburse the eligible reimbursement costs. Some examples of eligibility include the evaluation and identification of dead and dying trees that are threatening the public right-of-ways. It's not going to be all the trees in the forest or the trees in the park, but really what are the trees that are threatening public right-of-way and public infrastructure, and that's really certified by one of the arborists or a forester that's provided by CAL FIRE. So we do that in a team approach as we move forward and go and make those assessments. Another eligible cost is the removal of the trees threatening those public right-of-ways or infrastructure. And it may include trees on private property if that tree is deemed to be in sort of in context with the public right-of-way or deemed to be an immediate public health and safety threat. And so there's a process that we go through on that. And then another eligible cost is contracted tree removal, transportation, holding site fees, and disposal. So much of the work that Caltrans or CAL FIRE is doing, or what local government's doing about emergencies and the emergency response. This is really a Herculean effort, again, in this one team, one fight effort. The fact that we want to remain out in front of the evolving crisis. It's very, very important. Really, in my role as the governor's emergency service director, make sure that you have everything you need. Everybody has been leaning forward and out in front of this, and we'll continue on with this effort until this particular crisis is mitigated. So, thank you.
Governor Brown has been a visionary, and certainly in the environment, and so impacts to the environment and the tree mortality rate. And so I applaud you and his efforts, and certainly we want to be part of that, and that's what we're here to sort of highlight these issues. With that, as we discussed, that the trees, they don't know political boundaries.
Right. That the governor has made it very clear to you that this is something that he wants dealt with, that he wants it to be addressed, and that you've been given the authority and the portfolio to move your pieces forward. And that's encouraging, because we don't always see that.
Certainly, this is a long-term issue. While we're dealing with a crisis right now, we're really thinking long-term about the forests, and it's about the long-term. How do you rebuild this in a more resilient manner and maintain it over time so that these resources are with us for our children and our grandchildren? Is more of one of maintenance and less of responding to crises all the time. So I think that's a really important piece in terms of working together. There's a lot of urbanization in this state, and there's a lack of recognition that forests provide a huge amount of benefits to urban dwellers. And so it's not only the water connection, but again, from Cal EPA, there's a massive air quality issue that we have to address. When you think about losing forests, you not only have air quality impacts from fires, but you also have these big, huge carbon impacts. And when we think about the state's climate goals that are the most ambitious in North America, we need our forests, we need our natural and working lands, and we need our soil to help us meet those goals. So again, at Cal EPA, this is much bigger than just the tree mortality crisis, but this gets at the heart of California's iconic landscapes and the future of California for all of us and for our generations to come.
Just the authority, it's the quality of the team, the organizational structure, and the personal commitment that you all are showing to work together. It's really, really impressive, and keep at it.
And Commissioner Byer doesn't impress easily. So, who's our next speaker?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Malcolm Doherty, Caltrans Director, which of course is the Department of Transportation for the state of California. I would reinforce the comments by my colleagues about the teamwork going on in the task force. We are actively engaged in that. We are one of the landowners that Chief Pemlott talked about, and we are the landowner of a transportation system that is actively being utilized on a daily basis, and we need to protect that infrastructure, protect that transportation system, and also protect the users of that transportation system.
It's a short-term and long-term issue that we face out there that I think we're just beginning to come to grips with. I also want to pick up on the idea of the roles that forests play in sequestering carbon and storing carbon. All of those dead trees out there have stopped. The switches, speaking of switches, turned off. They're no longer absorbing carbon. The forests that replace them will pick that up, but it will take decades, if ever. Those underlying conditions that Dr. Stevens started this discussion talking about and others have picked up on are the same underlying conditions that have contributed to the tree mortality and contribute to things like the rim fire, the king fire, these big fires. Unhealthy forests that aren't resilient to drought conditions and so on. And our need to manage those forests, our needs to do something different than we've been doing, it's a challenging communications task, right? It's counterintuitive to most people that aren't more trees better, but we know and we understand that's not the case in many instances, and so addressing that issue, as you've heard, is fundamental to making sure that we don't continue to chase the problem. Right. I mean, that's really, we're unfortunately in the mode today of chasing the uncharacteristic fires that we see and the tree mortality. So in working with the scientific community, Dr. Stevens and many others, and with our colleagues, we think we've got a pretty good idea of what we need to do out there. And there is a sweet spot, if you will, of making forest healthy and resilient where all of those benefits continue to accrue. As we talk about what needs to be done out there, I think we do so thinking that we can find that sweet spot. And there's, in our region at least, significant agreement on the need to do something, and quite frankly, significant agreement on what to do. And that includes leaders from the environmental community, from the wood products industry, local government, our colleagues in state and federal government. So that is the good news. And I think that's really what we are trying to focus all of our attentions together on. And you've heard a lot about the use of fire, prescribed fire and managed fire, and we talked a little bit earlier about the important role that suppression still plays. So, it's a little simplistic to say good fire, bad fire, but I think we are trying to figure out again how to communicate that and how to address that issue and to return fire to the restoration role. Nature and our predecessors in the Native American community did a pretty good job of keeping our forest healthy and resilient and could withstand the kinds of things we're seeing now, and we haven't exactly continued with that. So finding that balance between protecting values and communities and so on and using fire is a critically important one to us. The problem is too big for us to do it any other way. So it is really kind of all of the above. It is doing the mechanical treatments and thinnings and harvesting that we heard earlier. It's using fire when we can, where we can, under the right and appropriate conditions. That means state, federal, local funding. That means private sector. That means beneficiaries, beneficiary pay concept, if we've seen the Delta. So figuring out how we come up with new investment models. How do we increase that? How do we find the money to do it? Because the reality is in the forest sector, we'll pay for it one way or the other. We either pay for it up front and maintain the benefits, or we pay for it on the back end with responding to events and so on. We have the nation's leading air quality laws, and they've done remarkable things for our state. Now we're trying to figure out how do we put fire back in the landscape in concert with those air quality laws. And it's challenging, and public health is critically important. But I think we're coming together to understand there are real implications to public health if we keep doing what we're doing. We can either find out how to put the smoke, use the smoke, have smoke out there when we can use fire in the right time, in the right way, or wait and let it happen to us. And we're in it together. I think there's a remarkable amount of cooperation going on. I would also say a tremendous amount of frustration. We're not doing enough to address the problem, and we just have to keep figuring out new and creative and innovative ways to do that. Shining the light on the problem is particularly helpful and useful. So again, thanks to the Commission for doing that, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Another one that I think plays in the current environment is forests as infrastructure. And this goes to the technical point that you made, which is thinking about them as infrastructure may change the funding mechanism. So a pretty cut and bite kind of amendment to the Stafford Act might be a kind of thing that a new senator might want to take up.
Assemblymember Bloom agreed with you last year on watersheds as infrastructure and passed a bill, AB 2480, that identifies source watersheds as infrastructure and eligible for infrastructure funding in terms of the water delivery. There's no money associated with that, though, and so maybe we need another bill to associate funding with management of upper watersheds or these source watersheds.
I really feel like what's happened with the RCDs is that we've been that critical piece of infrastructure that's been unfunded, and now a lot of these problems that we're seeing escalate because we don't have those boots on the ground that are out there doing that work.
Time is of the essence to start making meaningful changes on how we approach forest management, because it's not a matter of if, it's when, where, and how severe the next fire will be. To increase resiliency, our forests need restoration at the landscape scale, and key to this is the restoration of fire as the primary ecological disturbance process. We know that mechanical treatments alone will not get us to resilient forests. In the Southern Sierra, for example, less than a third of the landscape is even accessible to mechanical equipment. We must continue our critical work to overcome barriers to increase burning. We must increase community protection and work side by side with air quality experts to avoid adverse impacts on human health. We must increase outreach to help the public understand that not all fires are bad. We must take a hard look at the trade-offs between emissions of high-severity wildfires versus the more controllable emissions of prescribed and managed fires. It's up to us if we want to dictate when and where these emissions occur, or we could roll the dice and let Mother Nature decide. It's up to us. The Southern Sierra Prescribed Fire Council is pleased to be a signatory of the Fire MOU, and this is an unprecedented agreement that gives us the single best opportunity to move forward together and apply fire.
I'm Wendy Ritter-Bush, Director of State Legislative Relations for the Association of California Water Agencies, or ACWA. You may be wondering why water districts would be interested in forestry issues. We recognize that both water quality and water supply are impacted by these more frequent and severe wildfires. The ash and the sediment post-fire particularly degrade the quality of the water, and it also reduces the supply that we can garner from watersheds statewide. ACWA created a headwaters framework. Our board worked on this policy document. It identifies the role that headwaters play in California's water management system, outline the benefits of healthy headwaters, and identify current challenges and provide a brief history of headwaters management. We've got that on our website. In this document, we make over 30 recommendations, like investing and participating in landscape scale research that you've heard earlier today that explores water and forestry relationships, including ecological forest thinning, which can have multiple benefits for water supply reliability, water quality, and ecosystems. ACWA supports additional greenhouse gas reduction fund, cap and trade, and general fund dollars and bond obligation dollars to fund healthy forests in this upcoming 2017 state budget. We also have supported watershed funding in Prop 1, which is the recent water bond. Chapter 6 in Prop 1 allocates $1.49 billion with a B for competitive grants for multi-benefit ecosystem and watershed protection and restoration projects. So we will support watershed funding in future water bonds that are sure to come down in the near future. Aqua also is a proud and active partner in the COFWA coalition, and it's a really interesting combination of interest groups. It's Nature Conservancy California chapter, the Rural County Representatives of California, RCRC, California Forestry Association, and the California Farm Bureau Federation, along with Aqua. COFWA stands for California Forest and Watershed Alliance, and we're really right now collaborating, working on federal issues on ways to increase the pace and scale of forest restoration on federal lands, and also pursuing the federal legislation that's going to hopefully resolve the fire borrowing issue with the federal government, and we're working now on state issues.
Representing both in my conservation director job with Sierra Forest Legacy, but also as the co-chair of the Fire MOU partnership. And this has been an astounding experience in this last year to partner up, starting out with the Forest Service and us, and then moving out into the whole state of California. We've had, Director Pimlott actively join the partnership, the Park Service, BLM, Sierra Nevada Conservancy has been a huge help and supporter. NGOs, prescribed fire councils from around the state, 3 of them. The primary purpose is to increase the use of fire on this landscape for multiple resource benefits. So it's prescribed burning and the use of natural ignitions. Now that you've heard a lot of. Accomplishing that and looking at the barriers and the challenges is something that I hope the Commission does over this year in site visits and extended conversations, because it is easy to say it is changing a big ship around to get fire back in this system the way it ought to be. You heard Dr. Stevens express that concern, and his research has been fundamental over the last 2 decades. It's practically everything I've learned on this issue came from Scott and other researchers here in California. The good news is there's more people saying it, and more state level and federal level officials saying that we've got to get that fire exclusion has not been a good thing. It's been a disaster in these fire-prone systems. So decades of fire exclusion coupled with the ongoing drought. So there is a convergence happening. It's not just the ecology community and the people that live and die in the research world. It is getting more broadly understood all the time. We work with Cal EPA and the air regulators, because that's one of the tough places where we want to seek solutions where we can do the level of burning using the fire regimes and the fire frequency that we understand it to be in California as a benchmark. How far we depart from that is going to be equal to how much trouble we're going to have in building resilience into these forests. We've been talking with CAL FIRE and others about, we have this mortality situation, and I'll end with this. When are we going to be able to get in and act to manage some of this landscape before all these trees collapse? Mm-hmm. When we're going to have a real control problem at that point. We can get in during the phase when the needles drop and get fire on the ground in there and help manage some of those fuels.
I was glad to hear the observation about thinking of watersheds as infrastructure. We had actually worked with Assemblyman Bloom last year on that bill, which does fundamentally say that rather than just thinking of our water infrastructure as starting at the dam and flowing from there down to your tap, let's be realistic. Everything that gathers water upstream from the reservoir and brings it down to that point is part of our water infrastructure as well. And as Ashley said, we've got the better part of a century of deferred maintenance there, and it's really starting to catch up with us. So we need to start thinking about that as an infrastructure issue, and we need to get smarter about how we're doing the financing for dealing with that. Doing a general obligation bond here and there and throwing a little bit of money, it's not anywhere near going to ever be adequate to the task. And it's an expensive way to do things. We need to think about a more efficient way of financing the scale of work that we need to do there.
Rather than chasing the emergency, which we do need to do for the obvious reasons that have all been decided, is to get out in front. Our members probably use more prescribed fire than anybody in the state of California for purposes of fuels management and
and site preparation for planting. We have huge risks associated with lighting fires on our properties that may, if the conditions change, you could light a fire in the optimum prescription and end up with a $100 million bill associated with an activity. So liability is a huge issue that we need to be able to take a look at. I think we're a part of the prescribed fire working group and something that we really believe is one of the tools that we do use now and would like to use more.
Matter. And this commission could do a really good job. You've heard a lot of great solutions that I completely support. Figure out why they're not being done. One of the biggest surprises to me at a Forest Service meeting was hearing that on their land, only 25% of the available land that they had could actually be treated to prevent forest fire. And I never heard that before, and I didn't understand why. And some of it is steep slopes, but a lot of it is also land use designations that prohibit any kind of use, anything we can do to prevent these catastrophic wildfires. When someone from a urban community says, why should we do it? They just need to go to a forest and understand that this is where our soul is in California. This is where we go to fulfill something very deep within us that we need to connect to the landscape. And when I saw the ground after the King Fire and it was sterilized, it was white in some cases. That means in my children and my grandchildren's lifetime, a lot of that will not come back. That is what we have to stop, and hopefully this commission can come up with some ways to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I should mention, we will have another hearing, and I made reference to that in the opening remarks, and the second hearing is oriented towards rural counties, environmental organizations, Native American tribes, and others who have different perspectives. So
thank you so much.
Thank you. That concludes our public testimony. I want to thank everyone who participated and who attended.